The morning sun slanted gently over the low stone walls of St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows through the flowering hedgerows. Miss Marple, with her gardening gloves still smudged from compost, leaned delicately over a stubborn rose bush, coaxing an errant stem to behave. Birds chirped above, and a bee hovered noisily by the delphiniums. It was, by all appearances, a day of uninterrupted domestic tranquility. She had just risen from her kneeling cushion when Miss Hartnell appeared through the gate, flustered and winded from her uphill walk. "Miss Marple," she called, breathless. "A most delightful bit of news. Mrs. Ambrose has returned to the village." Miss Marple removed her gloves with mild interest. Felicity Ambrose. I had heard whispers from the grocer, though. One never quite trusts his excitement. He confused the vicar's wife once for Princess Marina. Miss Hartnell laughed. "Well, she is quite real and planning a garden luncheon this Sunday. I've just received my invitation. And so have you, I dare say." She handed over an ivory card with neat military handwriting. Miss Marple held the card delicately. 12 guests in the garden," she murmured. "How very precise. Ex-colonel's wife. Everything must be in order." Miss Hartnell gave a fond snort. Miss Marple nodded, eyes drifting across her rosebeds. "Indeed. Order is often prized by those who have lived too long with the opposite." Sunday arrived with a breeze that rustled the wisteria around Ambrose House. The grounds had been meticulously restored. Fresh gravel paths, chairs arranged in precise arcs beneath parasols, and a white table laid with bone china, silver cutlery, and thin-stemmed wine glasses that caught the sun. The guests arrived punctually, as they were meant to. Reverend Calthorpe, earnest and florid. Miss Weatherby, always overdressed and overinformed. The Whitakers from the newer estate. And Mr. Selwyn, a quiet artist who had recently moved into the converted mill. Miss Marple was shown to her seat by the housemaid, a pale girl with downcast eyes and careful hands. Felicity Ambrose herself stood poised at the head of the table, her silver hair coiffed into submission, her pearls real, her smile warm, but slightly too still. There was light talk of dahlias and post office hours and of Mr. Churchill's most recent broadcast, which had made Mrs. Bartlett quite anxious again. The wine was poured, the soup served, and laughter flowed in predictable rhythms. Miss Marple, ever unassuming, noted how precisely 12 places had been arranged, but one remained untouched, the napkin folded, the glass unfilled. She said nothing. Not yet. The meal moved forward with the polished inevitability of tradition. Cold meats and cucumber sandwiches followed the soup, and someone remarked on the early raspberries being particularly fine this year. Yet one chair, midway down the table, remained conspicuously vacant. When the plates were cleared for dessert, Felicity Ambrose spoke with graceful regret. Major Lytton had accepted, of course, but one assumes something must have detained him. He is not always prompt. Her pores held the weight of history, rather than irritation. Several heads nodded politely, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the unused wineglass. It had not been removed, nor disturbed. The place setting remained perfect. An empty chair, a silent guest. "I believe," murmured Miss Marple to no one in particular, "that superstition frowns upon 13 at a table." Mrs. Bartlett gave a quick intake of breath. "There were never 13. "No, indeed," said Miss Marple softly, looking again at the unclaimed glass. "Only 12. Though one wonders whether that was always intended." It was the kind of remark that could be taken as a passing observation, or something else entirely. But by then, the conversation had moved to holiday plans, and the odd sound the butcher's van had made the day before. By late afternoon, the hum of conversation from the luncheon had faded. Guests dispersed along well-worn paths, and the breeze picked up with the light snap of a coming change in weather. Miss Marple, back in her sitting room, arranged the invitation card into her scrapbook of village occasions, pausing briefly over the name, George Lytton. The next news came not from the vicarage nor from the post office, but from young Billy Cooper, who delivered newspapers and unwelcome announcements in equal measure. He appeared breathless on Miss Marple's doorstep. "They found him, Miss Marple. Major Lytton. Dead he is, in his own chair." She looked up with a stillness that held more understanding than surprise. "In his cottage." Billy nodded. "Windows shut tight. Housemaid says he hadn't collected his milk since yesterday. Constable Drake's on his way now." Later, over tea with the vicar's wife, Miss Marple remarked, "He was not a man to neglect his morning routine. Something must have truly disturbed him to keep him from his tea." The vicar's wife looked puzzled. "You think it was sudden?" Miss Marple stirred her cup once. "Perhaps not sudden, but certainly planned." Outside, the village clock struck 5, and in the distance, clouds gathered above the hedgerows. The drawing-room at the vicarage was flooded with a gentle afternoon light, filtered through starched lace curtains and the soft steam of a well-filled teapot. Miss Marple, seated with impeccable posture in a fireside chair, accepted a second scone with a modest smile. "I suppose," said Mrs. Calthorpe, buttering hers with unnecessary force, "that he may simply have forgotten. Men of that age grow absent-minded, though it seems rather extreme to forget one's luncheon invitation entirely, especially when one accepts in writing," added Miss Weatherby, her teacup trembling slightly with excitement rather than age. "Felicity told me so herself," he had replied most properly. "Not a last-minute arrangement." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "It was a formal setting, quite beautifully laid. And yet, an odd little detail. I noticed 13 places at the table before we began, though by the time we sat down, only 12 remained." The room hushed for a breath. 13, Mrs. Calthorpe repeated. "Oh, surely not," Miss Weatherby protested. "It must have been a serving error." "I wonder," murmured Miss Marple. "The unused place was laid properly, and the glass, if I recall, remained quite untouched." The scones were forgotten for a moment as all present exchanged glances, part curiosity, part superstition, and part something that trembled at the edge of fear. In St. Mary Mead, a place setting could mean rather more than a meal. By the following morning, the matter of the 13th place had ripened into full village discussion. At the baker's, at the greengrocer's, and most effectively at the post office, where conversations under the guise of queuing revealed more than most intended. "It might have been superstition," murmured Miss Hartnell to Miss Marple, as they inspected seed catalogues by the window. "Some folk won't abide 13 at a table. Perhaps someone noticed and quietly removed a setting." Miss Marple nodded with interest. "Yes, though it would suggest someone had counted, and early on too. One must wonder who was so observant, and why nothing was said aloud." Miss Hartnell blinked, as if the point had not quite occurred to her. "You think it wasn't superstition?" "I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that one must consider whether the missing guest was truly missing at all, or never meant to be known." A silence settled between them. Outside, a pair of school children hurried past on their bicycles, laughing. unaware of the chill that passed quietly through the minds of two elderly women standing by a rack of envelopes. There had been too many mysteries packed into that luncheon like sandwiches in a tin. A guest who did not arrive, a chair too precisely laid, and a hostess who, for all her polished hospitality, had glanced once too often at that untouched glass. It did not take long for the village's curiosity to settle, as it so often did, upon someone of lower standing and limited means. That week, it was Elsie, the young maid employed at Ambrose's house since Felicity's return. "She's not local," muttered Mr. Tomlin, the fishmonger. "Came from Exeter or somewhere, and she's twitchy, eyes too sharp, always seems to be listening." By the time the talk reached Miss Marple through the back window of the vicarage kitchen, the tale had developed a sharper edge. "They say she had words with Major Lytton not 3 days before," said Mrs. Calthorpe, folding her apron. "Saw it myself from the lane. He was wagging a finger and she didn't look meek about it." Miss Marple lifted her brows faintly. "Really? And did anyone hear what was said?" "No one that's saying so. But there's talk she threatened to leave. Walked out crying, they say." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, merely nodded. She had seen the girl at the luncheon, pale, quiet, and not at all the image of a temperamental servant. But village gossip had a way of reshaping facts into forms more useful to its purposes. "She laid the table, you know," Mrs. Calthorpe added. "All of it. Perhaps she made the 13th place before being told to take it away." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "she was told to make 13, and only 12 were ever meant to sit." While suspicion circled the maid, another quiet figure began to draw whispers. Mr. Selwyn, the artist who had taken up the disused mill house beyond the lane. Reclusive, reserved, and not particularly sociable, he had attended the luncheon at Felicity's invitation, yet had spoken to few. "He paints houses," said Miss Weatherby, lowering her voice. "Not portraits, mind you, just houses, and only when no one's looking." Mrs. Bartlett, who had passed his garden more than once, declared, "He covers the windows while he works. Not even the postman gets a proper look in." At the post office, Miss Marple observed him quietly. He purchased a single sheet of parchment and paid in coins so old they barely bore a monarch's face. "Nice hands," said Mrs. Calthorpe. "Not paint-stained at all." "Perhaps he wears gloves," Miss Marple replied, almost absently. She had no direct reason to suspect Mr. Selwyn of anything. Yet in villages like St. Mary Mead, the presence of someone who did not participate was often enough to warrant a question or two, and artists, in Miss Marple's long experience, had a habit of seeing things most people prefer to leave unrecorded. It was Constable Drake who revealed the first curious detail, without meaning to. At the grocer's, in conversation with the butcher, he let slip that Major Lytton's desk had been in perfect order, except for a torn envelope in the waste bin, red wax seal, no note. Miss Marple, overhearing from the dried goods aisle, took that information as one might accept a sudden breeze, cool, uninvited, but suggestive of change. Later that week she called politely upon Clara, Major Lytton's niece, who was staying on in the cottage to handle her uncle's affairs. "I'm not sure where to begin," the young woman admitted. "He was such a regimented man. His affairs were always tight." Miss Marple glanced around the cottage, neat, severe, and untouched by sentiment. She paused beside the writing bureau, its drawers half open, revealing letters and stiff note cards. One drawer had a distinct smell, scorched paper. Clara followed her glance. I found something burned there. I don't know what it was. The edge of a photograph, perhaps. I threw it out. It felt intrusive to look further." Miss Marple nodded kindly, but her thoughts gathered with quiet speed. A sealed envelope discarded, a photograph burned but not fully gone, and a luncheon with one place too many. She left Clara with a gentle squeeze of the hand. "Do you think," Clara asked, voice small, "that someone meant him harm?" Miss Marple smiled with an almost maternal softness. "My dear," she said, "harm in my experience is rarely sudden. It is often prepared, like a meal set for more than one. It was the kind of visit one made under the soft pretense of neighborly civility, neither urgent nor entirely social." Miss Marple arrived at Ambrose's house with a modest tin of honey biscuits and a hat pinned neatly above her curls. The maid who answered the door looked anxious to please, but wore the caution of someone who had recently been spoken to sharply. Mrs. Felicity Ambrose received her guest in the morning room, all French windows and pale upholstery. She was dressed in soft grays and ivory, a color scheme that, to Miss Marple's eye, suited those who wished to blend into their own surroundings. "I do hope you'll excuse the chaos," she said with a gracious nod. "It's rather a great deal of house to reopen after so many years." Miss Marple smiled, settling herself on a firm armchair. "Indeed, one forgets how quickly dust reasserts itself." The conversation flowed through safe channels: servants, the progress of the roses, the unfortunate unreliability of village postmen. But beneath the words, there was a sense of things unsaid. Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Ambrose's gaze shifted when Major Lytton's name was mentioned, how her fingers tensed slightly on the china cup. "He had a very particular nature," Felicity remarked lightly when pressed. "George always did find small slights difficult to forgive." Miss Marple sipped her tea and made a mental note that the word "always" were seldom applied without long knowledge or old hurt. She asked no more, but she had observed enough. The past, when it surfaced, did so not in dramatic confession, but through a casual turn of phrase. "We were once engaged, you know," Felicity said, gazing out toward the hedge, her tone as flat as the surface of the silver tray before her. "Before my husband, I mean. George and I. It was during the war. Burma." Miss Marple, though seemingly preoccupied with stirring her second cup, listened closely. Such things were quite common then. Felicity continued. People made choices quickly, or postponed them forever. In George's case, it was the latter. She gave a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. "It ended badly?" Felicity hesitated, then nodded. "We had planned to marry after his return, but something changed. He came back different, quieter, more rigid, and not the forgiving type. I married Ambrose instead. I imagine George never quite forgave either of us." Miss Marple watched the way her hostess touched the rim of her teacup, gently but without warmth, like someone checking for a crack that wasn't visible. "There are wounds," she said softly, "that close without healing." Felicity tilted her head. "That sounds like the sort of thing you might say at the end of a mystery novel." Miss Marple smiled, but her thoughts had turned inward. A broken engagement, a wartime change in character, a woman who had chosen stability over sentiment, and a man who had remained alone. Old hurts had curious ways of resurfacing, especially in places where the past was never truly buried. Clara Lytton arrived 2 days later by the early train from Paddington, and though she had written ahead, the village was abuzz nonetheless. She was a slender figure in a dove-gray coat, with pale gloves and a thoughtful gaze that lingered rather than darted. Miss Marple met her, quite by chance, near the post office. Clara had stepped out for a walk, she explained, needing air after an afternoon spent sorting papers and answering polite inquiries from neighbors who had hardly spoken to her uncle while he was alive. He kept to himself, she said, but not from unkindness. More, from fatigue. Fatigue of the soul, Miss Marple suggested. Clara looked at her for a moment. Yes, that's it. They walked together for a short while, the gravel crunching gently beneath their shoes. Clara spoke of her uncle's solitary habits, his reluctance to speak of the past, his tendency to retreat from invitations with vague excuses and thin smiles. He told me once that the worst things in life are not what people do to you, but what you have to live with after, she said quietly. Miss Marple glanced at the young woman, noting the tiredness beneath her composure. It was, she thought, always the most polite faces that bore the greatest weight, and Clara's face had the look of someone trying very hard not to let something slip. In the days that followed, Miss Marple made it her gentle business to observe Clara Lytton, not with suspicion, but with the trained compassion of someone who had over many years become an expert in hidden sadness. At the churchyard, Clara lingered by a bench longer than necessary. At the grocer's, she paused before the tea tins, as if they demanded a difficult decision. And when she spoke, there was a hesitancy, an uncertainty between each word, as though measuring what could safely be said. "She's not quite settled," remarked Mrs. Calthorpe, who had invited her for tea. "Quiet girl, pleasant, but always looks over her shoulder when someone enters the room, as though expecting to be called upon for something unpleasant." Miss Marple nodded. "I wonder if she fears being blamed, or has already blamed herself." She observed Clara one morning standing in the garden of her uncle's cottage, looking at the spot where the roses had begun to overgrow the path. Her shoulders were slightly bowed, her arms crossed, not against the cold, but against some inward chill. Miss Marple thought of a line she had once heard during a church sermon. "There is no burden heavier than the one we place upon ourselves." And watching Clara's stillness, she suspected the girl carried just such a weight. In St. Mary Mead, gossip had a way of braiding itself into memory until it resembled truth, and so it was with the history between Felicity and Major Lytton. "She left him for the Colonel," someone whispered in the bakery, "and not 2 months after George returned from the jungle." "Heartbroken he was," said the grocer's wife. "Wrote poetry, though he never published, of course." Others remembered things differently. "He was too proud, too particular, never forgave, even when there was nothing to forgive." The truth, Miss Marple knew, was likely is somewhere between the folds. The village carried its legends like heirlooms, polished, embellished, softened at the edges, but beneath them were raw emotions that had never quite faded. She thought of Clara, fragile in her quietness, and of Felicity, firm in her poise. 2 women bound to the same man by very different threads. One had left him, the other had watched him wither. And now he was gone, and something about his death refused to lie still. Miss Marple sat that evening with her knitting in her lap, the fire crackling softly. Outside, the wind shifted in the hedges. "Love," she murmured, "is never quite finished with us, even when we believe we're finished with it." Miss Marple had always believed that gardeners noticed more than they let on. They were the quiet chroniclers of a household's daily rhythms, privy to tensions, silences, and the comings and goings of those who preferred not to be seen. At Ambrose's house, the head gardener was a stooped, taciturn man named Simpkins. She found him trimming the box hedge near the rose garden, a secluded enclosed square of gravel paths and overgrown climbers. "Quite a charming corner," Miss Marple observed. "I had not noticed it on my last visit." "It were his favorite," Simpkins said without preamble. "The Major used to come regular, mornings mostly. Just stand there, not touching anything, just stand." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Did he speak with you?" "No, ma'am, just nodded. But he looked troubled, like he'd seen summit that didn't sit right." She turned her gaze to the rose arch. "He came alone?" Simpkins nodded. "That's just it, always alone. Even when others were about, he waited till the place was quiet." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. A man returning daily to the same silent place, not for beauty, but for memory. "Sometimes," she said gently, "we revisit gardens not for the flowers but for what happened among them." Simpkins bent back to his hedge. Well, some things root deeper than we'd like." At the post office, Miss Marple stood in line behind a woman buying stamps in multiples of 3, a superstition inherited from a superstitious aunt. She waited patiently, observing, until it was her turn. "Morning, Miss Marple," chirped Miss Hargreaves from behind the counter. "The weather's turned. Good for the roses, they say." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "and I found legal roses even thornier than real ones." Miss Hargreaves tilted her head. "That's so. I only mention it because I'd heard a letter arrived recently for Major Lytton from a solicitor in Bath. Curious, I thought. I didn't know he had any affairs beyond the village." Miss Hargreaves hesitated, then leaned forward just slightly. "Red seal, heavy paper. Arrived just under a fortnight ago. He signed for it himself, quite straight-faced, not like most who get legal post." Miss Marple smiled warmly. A man who'd made peace with paperwork, or one who knew exactly what it meant. Miss Hargreaves added, almost to herself. Miss Marple thanked her, collected her parcel of embroidery thread, and stepped outside. A solicitor's letter before death was often a coincidence, but a sealed letter arriving days before a man's murder in a village that prided itself on its tranquility, that was no coincidence at all. She tucked the detail away. In her experience, the post often carried more than messages. It carried motives. The vicarage parlor was warm that afternoon, the fire lit not for necessity but out of habit. Miss Marple, comfortably seated with her knitting on her lap, listened as Mrs. Calthorpe recounted yet another variation of the village theory surrounding Major Lytton's demise. "Apparently," said Mrs. Calthorpe with relish, "Felicity Ambrose was seen tearing something up right after the police came. In the drawing room, Elsie, her maid, told the housekeeper at the vicarage, bits of paper in the grate. Did she say what it was? Only that it looked official, yellowed, and she burned it properly, prodding it down so nothing remained but ash." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That's very particular. Most people only half-burn things. The corners always survive." Mrs. Calthorpe chuckled. "You've a sharp eye, Jane." Miss Marple smiled but said nothing. She remembered her own visit to Ambrose's house and the peculiar scent that had lingered near the fireplace. Acrid and sweet, like aged paper singed too quickly. Letters, wills, or photographs, things people preferred never to see again, were often sent into hearths. But they had a tendency, Miss Marple thought, to leave ghosts behind. Ghosts that returned in the form of questions no one dared ask, and Felicity, So composed, had the look of someone who had tried too hard to erase a memory, which meant that what she had destroyed was not incidental. It had been dangerous. Word reached Miss Marple through Mr. Denholm, the solicitor's assistant who sang baritone in the parish choir and had a weakness for almond biscuits. "It's not strictly public knowledge," he confided after evensong, "but since the Major's passing there's been a bit of murmuring. Apparently he altered his will shortly before his death." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Altered how?" Mr. Denholm glanced about, though the nave was empty. "He removed a bequest, not to Clara. She still receives the cartage and most of what he had. But he had left a considerable sum to a woman. Name redacted in the update. Only a note. Revoked in light of recent revelations." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested quietly in her lap, but her thoughts stirred. A woman. Quite. Not Clara's mother, nor a relative. Someone outside the family. But from the original document, the recipient's name was Felicity Ambrose. She did not react visibly. And the amount. Substantial. Enough to suggest a debt repaid or a promise kept. Miss Marple thanked him and left the church with slow steps. Promises, in her long experience, were the kind of currency that gained interest with time, and Felicity, for all her elegance, might well have been counting on it. Her revoked bequest was more than a financial slight. It was a declaration, a denial, and people had done far more for far less than Felicity had just lost. The mill house where Mr. Selwyn resided sat half-hidden behind overgrown hedgerows and a stone wall buckled with age. It had once belonged to a miller with too many daughters and too little grain. Now it was home to a man who painted in silence and showed his work to no one. Miss Marple arrived with a jar of plum preserves, an old trick she'd used when seeking information without appearing to do so. Mr. Selwyn, gaunt and courteous, accepted the gift with faint surprise. "You paint from memory, I believe?" she asked. "Sometimes," he replied. "Sometimes the memory paints me." It was the sort of remark that might have sounded dramatic from anyone else. But he said it quietly, with no flourish. He allowed her into the studio, a modest room with canvases stacked along one wall and the smell of linseed and dust in the air. One painting stood on an easel, unfinished. It showed a rose garden, unmistakably that of Ambrose's house. Two men stood in the foreground, one upright, pointing, the other turned partially away, his face in shadow. Miss Marple peered closer. The man who pointed was clearly Major Lytton. The other's identity was less certain. "That's not Mr. Ambrose," she said. "No," Mr. Selwyn replied. "That man hasn't been seen for years." But Mrs. Ambrose recognized him immediately. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes did not leave the canvas. Sometimes, she thought, people went to great lengths to erase a person from life, yet could not prevent them reappearing on canvas. The arrest came with all the dreadful politeness St. Mary Mead could muster. Constable Drake arrived at the cottage mid-morning, removed his helmet with solemn respect, and informed Clara that she would need to accompany him for questioning. It was not shouted from the rooftops, but within an hour the whole village knew. "It's the pills," murmured Miss Weatherby to Miss Marple over the rhubarb jam shelf. "Found in the Major's drawer, labeled with her initials. Sleeping tablets, the pharmacist says. Enough to kill a man, if taken with brandy." Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. Clara had always seemed uneasy, yes, but not vicious. There was a difference between sadness and spite. Later, over tea with the vicar's wife, she reflected aloud, It's a curious thing, sleeping tablets. People assume intent when they find them, but rarely ask how they came to be where they are. She had no motive, Mrs. Calthorpe insisted. At least, not one I can fathom. He was leaving her the cottage, wasn't he? Miss Marple stirred her tea. Perhaps someone wished to suggest motive, or simply to shift attention. But who? Miss Marple did not answer. She was thinking of the untouched wine glass, the 13th place, and the slow tremble in Clara's voice when speaking of her uncle. In her long experience, the falsely accused rarely protested. They were too bewildered by the sudden coldness of suspicion. Clara had that bewilderment about her, and it troubled Miss Marple deeply. 2 days later, a quiet sense of unease gave way to open alarm. The vicarage had been broken into, not ransacked, not robbed, but entered and exited with deliberate precision. The only item missing was the guest book. Miss Marple heard the news from the vicar himself, who was still too puzzled to be angry. "It's baffling," he admitted, rubbing his forehead. "No silver taken, no drawers opened, just the book. My wife insists I left it on the bureau. It's always there after a luncheon." "It records who came," Miss Marple said softly, "and perhaps who didn't." The vicar looked startled. "You think someone's name was in it?" "Or not," she replied. "The omission of a name can be more revealing than its presence." The break-in became the new focus of the village's gossip. Some said it was mere mischief. Others whispered of cover-ups and clever criminals. Miss Marple said very little, but her mind turned again to that strange luncheon, to the wine glass untouched, the place carefully laid and quietly removed. And now, a book gone missing, its blank spaces just as telling as the ones filled. Sometimes, she knew, erasing something left behind a louder trace than leaving it in plain sight. It was the maid, Elsie, who finally broke her silence, not through courage but through fear. Miss Marple found her one afternoon, seated on the back steps of the vicarage kitchen, pale and trembling, her apron twisted in her hands. "I didn't want to say anything," she began, eyes darting nervously. Not after what she said." "Who said?" Elsie swallowed. "Mrs. Ambrose. She said it wasn't my place to repeat things heard in passing, that I'd regret it if I did." Miss Marple nodded gently. "People often confuse silence with loyalty." Elsie shook her head. "It wasn't loyalty. I was scared." She looked up, voice dropping to a whisper. "I saw them at the luncheon, before everyone sat. The Major came early. They were standing by the table, arguing, not shouting but tight-like, angry. He said something about not letting it go on. And she said, 'You don't understand. You never did.' Then he looked down at the wine glass. Her hand was shaking. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. 'Did he drink it?' Elsie hesitated. I don't know, but I think she switched the glasses. I set 12. Then she told me to remove one, quickly, quietly. She said someone couldn't make it." Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on the girl's arm. "You did nothing wrong. But I feel I did, because I saw, and I said nothing." Miss Marple's gaze turned distant. "The worst secrets," she said softly, "are those we are asked to pretend we haven't seen." By now the luncheon had become legend, its details turned and twisted like thread in a village loom. But Miss Marple, methodical as always, returned not to the drama but to the arrangement. The missing guest, the untouched wine, the maid's frightened account of glasses changed and voices raised, and most crucially, the words exchanged. "You never understood." A statement not of argument, but of history, of a grievance long buried and unearthed too late. Miss Marple pondered this during a walk to the post office. Mrs. Hargreaves was recounting the oddity of that day's wine selection. Felicity opened a special bottle, she said. Said it was French, saved for an occasion. I heard her tell Miss Weatherby. Did she pour the glasses herself? Miss Marple asked. She did. Insisted on it. Another thread. A hostess who insisted on pouring, a guest who argued just before the meal, and a place, setting removed. After a substitution. Miss Marple returned home deep in thought. In stories, poisonings were often blunt instruments. In real life, they were slow, careful manipulations of timing and perception. It was becoming clear to her that the question was not who had drunk from which glass, but which glass had never been meant to be drunk from at all. It came to Miss Marple one morning while pinning back her climbing sweet peas. The clarity of it arrived as sudden truths often did, quietly but with undeniable weight. She had been asking who had missed the luncheon, but that was the wrong question. The real question was, who had never intended to be seen at the luncheon? A 13th place, quietly removed. A host insistent on pouring, a glass untouched, a guest unspoken. Suppose there had been someone else, someone present before the others arrived, someone no one else was meant to notice, perhaps someone believed long gone. Suppose, too, that Major Lytton had recognized them. That would explain the argument, the threat, the urgency in his voice. I won't let this continue. Miss Marple folded her gloves over the garden bench. In her long life she had known that the dead did not always stay dead, not in stories, not in secrets, and not in villages like St. Mary Mead. The manager of the Market Down Bank was a small, precise man named Mr. Fenwick, with a parting as sharp as his diction. He had once declined Miss Marple a halfpenny discrepancy, with an apology so polished it had almost seemed a compliment. I do hope this is not an inconvenience, Miss Marple said mildly as they sat in the small consultation room. Not at all, Miss Marple. Your inquiries are always most discreet. It was the word she had hoped for. I gather Major Lytton had recent dealings with you? Fenwick nodded, folding his hands. Yes. He updated his will with us a little over 3 weeks ago. Brought in the papers himself, meticulous handwriting as ever. Was the change significant? Quite. A beneficiary removed, a portion redirected to his niece. He seemed resolved, but not at peace. Miss Marple nodded. And the previous recipient? Fenwick paused, then gave a small sigh. Mrs. Felicity Ambrose. A silence fell. He said, Fenwick continued, that the truth altered the obligation. Outside the window the branches stirred gently in the wind. Miss Marple rose slowly. The truth, she murmured, has a way of unsettling even the most loyal of intentions. She thanked him, made her way down the front steps of the bank, and stood quietly by the wrought iron fence. The financial changes made sense now, not of vengeance, but of betrayal. Something had been discovered, and the Major, it seemed, had decided not to reward silence any longer. It was in the far corner of the village library, tucked behind a shelf of biographies no one had touched in months, that Miss Marple found the book. She had remembered Clara mentioning it. The Retreat of Empire, a dry military memoir the Major had once insisted she read, to understand the discipline of command. Clara had returned it the day after his passing. Miss Marple requested it politely from Miss Bell, the librarian, who was more curious than helpful. She settled herself at the reading table and leafed through the yellowing pages. Page 114 held the surprise. A photograph, creased at the corner and unmarked, had been slipped between the pages. It had been folded twice, perhaps hastily. Carefully, Miss Marple opened it. A woman stood in partial profile, turning slightly from the camera. Her expression was unguarded, the eyes watchful, almost wary. She wore a summer dress, blue one might imagine, and held a ribbon in her hand. Miss Marple blinked once. It was Felicity, or someone uncannily like her. She looked again. The shape of the face, the angle of the shoulders, it matched the poise of a woman who had grown practiced in appearing composed. Why would Clara have returned such a photograph? Or had she ever seen it? Miss Marple tucked it into her handbag with great care. In the village, faces were rarely unfamiliar, but sometimes familiarity was only half the truth. The other half, as she knew well, was identity, and identity was seldom simple. At home, Miss Marple placed the photograph on her mantel and studied it in the softened light of early evening. The likeness was striking, but there was a softness to the woman in the picture, an openness Felicity Ambrose did not possess. Not now, perhaps not ever. The photo was older, 10, maybe 15 years. The dress was from a past season. The ribbon, curiously, was held not at the waist but pressed to the lips, as though carrying sentiment or memory. Miss Marple recalled the luncheon, the careful arrangement of glassware, the tremor in Felicity's hand when the wine had been poured. The question pressed quietly forward. Was it Felicity, or someone else entirely? The face, though similar, held a vulnerability that the current Mrs. Ambrose would never willingly display. Miss Marple reached again into her handbag and held the photograph beside a newspaper clipping of Felicity's return to St. Mary Mead. Side by side, the resemblance was undeniable, and yet not identical. She tapped the photo gently. Not who, she whispered, but when. And that, she knew, was the key to what the Major had seen, and perhaps what had cost him his life. The chemist's shop in St. Mary Mead was a tidy little establishment, full of glass jars, lavender soap, and the faintest whiff of menthol and beeswax. Mr. Travers, the chemist, greeted Miss Marple with deferential courtesy. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Still using the lavender salve, are we?" "Indeed, Mr. Travers. It's marvelous for the joints, though I'm here on another errand. A rather delicate one." He raised an eyebrow. "I believe," she said gently, "a bottle of chloral hydrate was dispensed recently. Tablets, prescribed for someone at Ambrose House." "Ah." Mr. Travers turned to the book with a small frown. "Let me see." He thumbed through a ledger, finger pausing halfway down a column. "Yes, 12 tablets, signed for by, yes, here it is, Mrs. Felicity Ambrose, not Clara Litton. No, Mrs. Ambrose. She mentioned headaches, stress." Miss Marple nodded. "And how long ago was this?" 10 days before the luncheon, give or take." "Did she collect it personally?" "She did." Miss Marple offered a small, satisfied smile. "Thank you, Mr. Travers. You've been most helpful." Outside, the sunlight had shifted across the cobbled pavement. The bottle found in the Major's cottage had been labeled with Clara's initials, but it had been Felicity who procured the contents. It was not the first time a label had lied, nor would it be the last. But Miss Marple had long since learned that truth, like medicine, often came in bottles too easily relabeled. Mr. Selwyn received Miss Marple with the same faint air of polite confusion that all artists seem to carry when interrupted. She presented him with a jar of Greengage preserve, which he accepted with a small, bewildered smile. "I wonder," Miss Marple began gently, If I might see your work again. The piece in the corner, the one you said was incomplete." He led her into the studio. The painting still stood on the easel. The garden of Ambrose's house, rendered in moody light, with two figures near the rose arch. One was unmistakably Major Lytton. The other, a man turned slightly, his features indistinct, was caught mid-confrontation. "I found that I paint things I don't fully understand," Mr. Selwyn said. "This one. It painted itself, really?" Miss Marple stepped closer. "I believe I know who that is," she said quietly. Mr. Selwyn looked up in surprise. "Not Ambrose." "No," she said. "Someone else. Someone Felicity has long claimed was lost at sea." The artist's brow furrowed. Her husband. She had a husband, yes, a colonel. Declared missing, presumed drowned. But this is not a memory. This is a moment. Selwyn was quiet for a long time. "I only glimpsed him once, near the house. No one else saw. I thought I must have imagined him." "You didn't," said Miss Marple. Major Lytton had seen the man too, and he had known what that meant. A marriage invalidated, an estate falsely claimed, her deception quietly nurtured over years until one man had threatened to expose it. Miss Marple traced the figure in the paint with her eyes. The 13th guest, not present at the table but not absent either, hidden in plain sight, and seen by only one man. She folded her hands. "The dead," she said softly, "have a way of returning, especially when they were never dead at all." It was a soft and windless evening when Miss Marple requested the company of a select few at the vicarage. There was no summons, no urgency, only a note of invitation penned in her careful hand and delivered with quiet efficiency. The drawing-room had been arranged with thoughtful restraint, armchairs positioned by the hearth, a tray of tea and scones unobtrusively laid. The guests, Clara Lytton, Mr. Selwyn, Mrs. Ambrose, Constable Drake, and Reverend Calthorpe, took their seats with the confused patience of those unsure whether they had come to hear a confession or receive one. Miss Marple stood by the window for a moment, the light from the lace-curtained panes drawing soft edges on her silhouette. Then she turned and, in her usual quiet voice, began. "I have always believed," she said, "that the truth is seldom loud. It tends to wait, politely, until all other theories have exhausted themselves." The room remained still. "And so, I would like, if you'll permit me, to offer what I believe to be the truth of Major Lytton's death, not as a matter of theory, but of sequence, of what happened, and why." Her hands were folded, her voice firm without force. "I do not come with accusations, only clarity, and perhaps understanding." Outside the church bell rang once, as if to mark the beginning of something long overdue. "It began," Miss Marple continued, "not with murder but with recognition." She glanced briefly at Mrs. Ambrose, whose posture remained statuesque, though her fingers tensed against her gloves. "Major Lytton, you see, had recently come into knowledge, an encounter, a confirmation, and finally, documentation, that the man presumed to be Colonel Ambrose, lost at sea so many years ago, had not drowned at all." A sharp intake of breath stirred the room. He had been living quietly under another name, away from scrutiny, away from legal complication, but he returned, or attempted to, and was seen near Ambrose's house, by you, Mr. Selwyn, and later by Major Lytton. She turned her gaze toward the artist, who blinked but did not speak. The Major knew what that meant. The marriage to Felicity was never legal, the estate never hers to claim, and whatever arrangement had been made to keep that truth quiet was undone the moment he saw the man in the rose garden. Miss Marple paused, then spoke more gently. But this was not blackmail, nor vengeance. The Major, I believe, intended only to correct what he now felt complicit in hiding. His conscience would not let it stand. Felicity said nothing. She stared ahead, but her shoulders had dipped imperceptibly, as though a great weight she had long held upright had finally begun to slip. Miss Marple folded her hands once more. A life built upon absence cannot withstand presence. That was the fatal shift. The implications, Miss Marple said with quiet precision, were considerable. She looked around the room with an expression of solemnity, not judgment. The estate, the house, the investments, none of it legally Felicity's. The will Major Lytton had initially honored was based upon a marriage that, in the eyes of the law, had never existed, and once he knew the truth, he amended that will. Constable Drake stirred uncomfortably. And more than that, he intended to come forward, to make the knowledge public, or at the very least, legal. Clara's face had gone pale. He never told me. No, Miss Marple said kindly, because he wanted to spare you. But the papers were already in place, his visit to the solicitor in Bath, the request at the bank, all done quietly, but thoroughly. She turned back to Felicity. I believe he told you his intentions at the luncheon, perhaps not with cruelty, but with finality. And in that moment you saw not only disgrace, but collapse, the unraveling of everything you had maintained for so long. Mrs. Ambrose lowered her gaze, but her face remained unreadable. Whether from fear or desperation, Miss Marple concluded, a decision was made. And it was that decision which ended a man's life. It was clever, Miss Marple said almost gently. So very clever, and quiet. Her tone bore no admiration, only the calm weight of truth. The luncheon was arranged with 12 guests invited, but 13 place settings were laid. This, I believe, was no accident. One setting in particular was never intended to be used by any real guest. It was set as a decoy, its presence explained later by saying someone had failed to arrive. She looked at the others. But in that glass, the one no guest ever touched, was the fatal dose. Clara looked stricken. I thought he drank his own wine. He did, Miss Marple said, but not from his original glass. The glasses were subtly rearranged just before the meal began. The one meant for the phantom guest was passed to Major Lytton. He was none the wiser. Constable Drake frowned. So the poisoned wine wasn't meant for him. No, it was always meant for him. The empty chair was a device, a way to introduce the poison without suspicion, to place it where it wouldn't be noticed until it was too late. Miss Marple turned to Felicity, whose stillness had grown heavy. You poured the wine yourself. You adjusted the seating under the pretense of a last-minute change, and you waited. A long silence followed. Mrs. Ambrose finally lifted her chin. Her voice was even, but low. It was never meant to happen this way. No, Miss Marple replied quietly. It never is. Outside, the wind stirred faintly against the window pane like a breath held too long. When Felicity Ambrose spoke again, it was not in protest, but in reflection. I had a life, she said almost to herself. A house, a name. I was someone. And then he appeared, like a ghost, like something I'd buried properly and mourned and folded away. No one interrupted. I loved Ambrose, she went on, her voice thinning. I truly did. But I loved security more. After George ended our engagement, I found myself drifting. When Ambrose proposed, I said yes before he finished asking. She looked at Miss Marple. I didn't kill for money, or even for reputation. I did it because I couldn't bear for it to vanish, for it all to be meaningless. Miss Marple's eyes were soft. You had built your life on a carefully tended illusion, and when someone threatened it, you defended it, in the only way you believed would leave you standing. Felicity gave a short, bitter laugh. And now? Now, Miss Marple said, you have a choice. To carry the truth, or to let it be carried by others. No one else spoke. Clara's hands were clasped in her lap. Mr. Selwyn looked away. Felicity rose slowly, as though the effort cost her years. I'll make my statement, she said, not for forgiveness, but for accuracy. Miss Marple nodded once. In St. Mary Mead, confessions did not come in courtrooms, nor justice in spectacle. They arrived in drawing rooms, in quiet tones, among lace curtains and fading light. And always, they left behind a silence that felt, oddly, like peace. The late afternoon sun dappled the parlor walls of Miss Marple's cottage, casting the faintest gold on the lace-edged curtains. From the open window drifted the sound of birdsong, unhurried and light, like a conversation with no particular urgency. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair by the fire, her needles clicking gently as a fine length of rose-colored wool took shape in her lap. The scent of lavender polish mingled with a faint trace of tea, long since cooled. Outside, the world had resumed its rhythm. The vicar cycled past, his basket carrying hymnals and bread. A child called after a skipping rope. Someone's dog barked twice and was shushed. It was not peace exactly that filled the room, but a return, a resettling. The village had been stirred but not shattered, and Miss Marple, who had known more patterns than most, of people, of knitting, of life, carried on threading them all back together. Clara left by the first morning train, her suitcase modest, her farewell quieter still. She had thanked Miss Marple with a handwritten note left upon the table. Graceful, reserved, signed simply, with enduring gratitude. No one blamed her. Not anymore. Time and truth had worked their subtle alchemy, as they often did in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Ambrose, now under house arrest, awaited the slow wheel of justice from behind her polished gates. She received few visitors, though the baker still delivered her loaves, and the postmistress made sure to pass along the society newsletters. But already the village had begun to soften the story. She had loved deeply, some said. She had feared disgrace. She had tried to hold on to what little remained. It was how things were remembered in such places, with a touch of mercy and a turning away from sharpness. Only Miss Marple perhaps remembered it exactly as it had been. A few days later, a small parcel arrived at Miss Marple's door, tied with twine, the handwriting unfamiliar but steady. Inside was a plum cake, perfectly baked, and a folded watercolor wrapped in tissue paper. Miss Marple laid the painting on her lap and unfolded it slowly. The image was of her garden, viewed from the side path, bathed in soft morning light. There she sat, barely sketched. Just a suggestion of gray hair, a shape in a shawl, a hand resting over yon. But the roses were detailed in loving precision. Each bloom a quiet hymn. She studied it for a long moment, then smiled, faintly, knowingly. There was no note, but none was needed. Mr. Selwyn had seen what most had missed. Not a woman solving things, but a woman who noticed, who remembered, who sat at the edge of life's performance and quietly mended the hems. Miss Marple leaned back, letting the sunlight rest on her face. Some mysteries ended with thunder, others with the hush of wool being folded, the hum of birds in the hedge, and a garden that had, at last, returned to bloom. And beneath it all, the quiet understanding that the truth, when finally spoken, rarely raised its voice. And so, the final place at the table was never meant for a guest, but for a ghost, a secret long buried in the soft soil of appearances. In St. Mary Mead, truths are rarely shouted. They whisper gently, from teacups left untouched, from glances unshared, from lives so carefully arranged they nearly slip past detection. But Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unmatched eye for human nature, saw what others would not. That guilt is not always loud, and love, when built on falsehood, can unravel with a single truth. This story was not merely about murder, but about what people will do to protect the lives they've built, even if those lives are built on sand. In the end, Felicity Ambrose didn't grieve the crime. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.